Kate Milafalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Before I start talking here, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for subscribing, because I know that you have, and I know that you've double checked all your subscriptions to everybody else as well, and the little bell and all that thumbs up, all the nonsense. I tried to read my Outlook email, which is a different email that I have, through the app today. And it would not give me my mail until I confirmed I was me. So I went through all this, put in this code and put in that code and do this and do that. And finally it said, now, just to be sure that you're you, look at these pictures and prove you're not a robot. Now, it wasn't the usual grid with, how many pictures have a post office box or how many people have a bicycle. Not that. It was this little tiny thing that I could not see. I can't even tell you what I was looking at because it was so small. 2 squares with little artwork in them, and you were supposed to move the person standing on something to the thing that looked like what was in this picture. I couldn't tell what any of it was. So I was just randomly moving this thing around, and I kept getting it wrong. And I finally had to go back and do a whole other rigmarole. So my advice is the computers are taking over. Okay. Now I've gotten that out of my system, I feel a little bit better. Also, let me apologize to anybody. I put a video up today meant to show in a couple of days. I try to get ahead of things when I have other stuff going on. I scheduled it. There's a way you can schedule a video to be released. I scheduled it. Everything looked good. And it went live. It went up anyway. I caught it before too many people had watched it. It wasn't my intention to reveal its wonderfulness until the day I wanted it to be shown. But it's just one endless thing after another with technology. Thank you for allowing me to vent. Okay, today we're going to talk about someone whose name was familiar to me when it came up. I was doing videos on somebody else. Turns out that person and this person were really good friends. And I really had to pause a minute. I remember his name. I'm talking about Bishop James Albert Pike. Excuse me. I remember his name from my childhood, my teenage years, because he was in the news quite a bit. And my parents reviled him. I didn't bother to figure out what the issue was. I had more pressing things to worry about, like, was I going to get home in time to see Dark Shadows? Didn't really care about Bishop Albert Pike. But I formulated this notion of him in the back of my head based on what my parents said, and I thought he was a terrible person. I didn't know why, just thought he was. So I thought, oh, he was mentioned in the work I did on Philip K. Dick, because apparently they were extremely close friends. And I thought, this is incongruous. This doesn't make sense. So I started to look up Bishop Pike, and I thought, oh, he deserves a video. This is a very interesting person, much maligned, not perfect, but very interesting. And he came to a very unusual end. So let's talk about James Albert Pike, born February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1913 in Oklahoma City. And he died in 1969 under mysterious circumstances, which we'll get to. His father died when he was 2 years old. His mother remarried. She married a lawyer. They moved to California. So he was raised in California and not in Oklahoma. He was raised a Catholic. He graduated in 1930 from Hollywood High School. This is not the impression I had of him. I don't know why, but I thought he was English. Uh, he considered the priesthood. I thought he was English because he was a bishop, but he was married. Somehow I knew that. And that didn't make sense. So I assumed he was Anglican and he was in England, but he was an Episcopalian. Well, first he was a Roman Catholic. After he graduated, he actually considered becoming a priest. So he went to Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit school, but you can depend on the Jesuits. He became an agnostic. And he ended up transferring to UCLA, spent a year there, and then went to USC. And I did notice this kind of odd pattern of behavior in his life. He never stuck any place. It was like he had itchy feet, he was restless, or he couldn't find what he was looking for. He got his Bachelor of Arts in 1934. He got his law degree from USC in 1936, joined the bar. In 1938, he won a Yale fellowship and, completed the fellowship in 1938 and had a doctorate in law, so he was a PhD. He worked in some departments of the New Deal. I didn't get too much into it. And while he was doing that, he was a professor, an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and at George Washington University. He established a law office eventually and got married in 1938, but then divorced in 1941. In 1942, he married the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, and in 1942, he worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence. I thought that was interesting. In 1943, he became a postulant in the Episcopal Church. This is somebody who's asking for entry, so it's to see, are you a good fit? In 1944, he worked for the War Administration in some kind of maritime commission, but he did become inactive in the military because in 1944, he became a deacon, which is a level below a priest, above, just your ordinary everyday sinner. I thought this was really interesting. As a deacon, they tell you, where you're going to work. You kind of the assistant around the place. His first church was St. John's Episcopal Church, which might ring a bell. If you remember the church right off Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., with the upside down Bible. And the bishop that works there now is the woman who spoke after the inauguration in the church and raised some eyebrows. So interesting that he would get his start there. At the same time, he was the chaplain for George Washington University for the students. He entered the Virginia Theological School in 1945-46 and then transferred again to the Union Theological, but he got his Bachelor of Divinity in 1951. I do believe that's an undergraduate degree in being a priest. That's the best I can think. It's like a degree in theology. He was ordained in 1946 in the Episcopal Church, and he became the rector of Christ Church in Poughkeepsie and the chaplain for Vassar at the same time. And a rector, that comes from the word that means to the right. So I'm thinking they probably had to make sure things were right. He did all the, the detail work. In 1949, just a little bit below middle management, maybe. In 1949, he became the chaplain at Columbia and the co-founder of the Department of Religion at Columbia. He stayed on the faculty of Columbia, but also added to that in 1952, the dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. You see, he's kind of moving around quite a bit. We're not just going to focus on his job credentials. There is some purpose to it. He used his pulpit at this point. Keep in mind, he's Columbia's New York, right? He's in New York. And he's using his pulpit to discuss issues of the day, political, social issues. He fought very openly with Roman Catholic bishops in the area about their attacks on Planned Parenthood. and their opposition to birth control. He wasn't afraid to take a stand. He was offered an honorary degree from the University of Southern Tennessee, but then he said no because he found out they didn't allow African Americans to be students. But he's very savvy, and I love what he did. So he was going to say no to the school. And he wrote a letter, and he took a copy of the letter and sent it to the New York Times and timed it so it got to the New York Times before the school got their letter. So the New York Times called the Tennessee University to ask for their reaction to him refusing on the basis of their racism, and they didn't know what he was talking about. It's pretty clever. He challenged Senator McCarthy publicly, the House Un-American Activities guy. McCarthy had come out and said 7,000 American pastors are part of a Kremlin conspiracy. And he said, come on. At that point, Eisenhower supported Bishop Pike. And as a result, that was the kind of the chink in the dam of McCarthyism. He began to lose his power at that point. So Pike was instrumental in putting an end to that nonsense. He became the spokesperson of choice for liberal Protestantism. He was offered his own weekly TV show by ABC. And this might sound odd, although, you know, televangelists are a thing now, but in those days, not so much on TV. But there was a guy called Fulton Sheen, and he was a Catholic, and he was extremely right-wing. So this was sort of a contrast to him, and Pike became far more popular. He brought up every week controversial hot topics. So here are some of the topics of his shows week by week: birth control, abortion laws, racism, capital punishment, apartheid, anti-Semitism, and farm worker exploitation. And at the end of every session, every week, every episode, he gave a 5-minute commercial for God at the end. In 1956, he made a trip to Israel to study the plight of Arab refugees. 1956. In 1957, he was part of a 7-person Zellerbach Commission. This was part of the International Rescue Committee. This was a larger international umbrella group that studied, they wanted to study European Iron Curtain refugees, people escaping from Eastern European Soviet occupied countries, places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In 1958, he was consecrated as a bishop. He became the 5th Bishop of California. Not number 5 in a row, but serially like the 5th one ever. In 1966, he resigned. So he was there for, about 8 years. He had, which we'll go into detail with in a minute, personal loss. He had an interest in the paranormal. He got tired of attacks by the diocese on him, and he got tired of fighting with the administration of the church. He was just exhausted. So he became the senior fellow, and I had no idea. This just really took me by surprise. He became the senior fellow for the study of democratic institutions in Santa Barbara. If you're new and you don't know this, I was raised in Santa Barbara, and I know this place because we drive by it, and my father always said something disparaging about it. I had no idea. What did I know? It's interesting because you could be socially very conservative, but in your humanitarian issues be very liberal. That was a very common thing when I was growing up. So I went to school with a lot of people whose parents were what today would be considered bleeding heart liberals about personal social issues, things like healthcare and housing and food and civil rights and that kind of thing. And at the same time, be all uptight about birth control and gay issues, LGBTQ. I mean, it wasn't even a thing, right? And what would be another one? Divorce. So, yeah, past that building every day on the way to school. It was begun by Robert Maynard Hutchins, and I looked him up because I didn't know anything about him. He was a progressive who was a supporter of civil liberties. He would have guest thinkers. It was a think tank, and he would have guest thinkers, including Linus Pauling, Alex Comfort, who wrote The Joy of Sex, and Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. So you see where their minds are. Pike, in the meantime, as he was working with this think tank, he was a professor at Berkeley School of Law and also at the Graduate Theological Union. So there was no working from home. There was no Zooming in. So I'm assuming that he was able to stay one place and work for the other. I don't know quite. Did he travel once a week? I couldn't find that information. His episcopate, that means his time as a bishop, was marked by controversy. He was a member of a group called the Protestant and Other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. He was against John Kennedy because John Kennedy was Catholic and had Catholic views, and the Catholics were too conservative for Bishop Pike. That is why my parents didn't like him. He promoted a living wage for workers. Shocking. He advocated for the inclusion of the LGBTQ community into the church. That's not what they were called at the time, but he did not like the discrimination. He fought really actively for civil rights. He was the first one in the Episcopal Church to ordain a woman as deacon. And it was not even acknowledged until after he died, but now it is a legitimate, accepted step to the priesthood. So he was a revolutionary. He tried to raise money to pay for a ransom to free the people involved in the Bay of Pigs who became political prisoners. He belonged to the Citizens Committee for a Free Cuba. I'm not 100% certain. I was going to look this up, but didn't Oswald belong to that group? Something similar. He invited Martin Luther King to speak at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. Now, remember, he's working at Berkeley part of the time. He was working all over the place. It's remarkable. But he invited Martin Luther King to speak at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco after the Selma March. He rejected central Christian beliefs, but he's bishop. He's a Christian bishop. So he scoffed at okay, let me put it this way. A lot of the things that he questioned were doctrinal elements that were voted on at the Nicene Council, but they were not the original earliest Gnostic beliefs of the very earliest people that we would call early Christians, pre-Roman Catholic, pre-Roman Christian. So he didn't believe in the virginity of Mary. He didn't believe in the doctrine of hell. He didn't believe in the conventional Catholic description of the afterlife, but I couldn't find out. He wrote a lot of books, so I'm sure that his thought processes are out there somewhere. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He said what the church needs is fewer beliefs and more belief. A group of bishops, led by some bishop from Florida, of course, started heresy procedures against him, which they kept up in 62, 64, 65, 66. This is why he was always in the news. The Episcopal House of Bishops, this is like the big bosses, they didn't want to do a public trial. That was just too much exposure, too much controversy. Why air your dirty laundry was their attitude. So they created a censure motion, like we won't have a trial, we won't make a big deal of this, we'll give him a slap on the wrist and denounce his conduct and say we're not happy with him, he's been a bad boy. But Pike said, oh no, I want a trial. I want to clear my name. I want to let my point of view be public, and that wasn't popular. So they did come to a compromise. The Episcopal Church would make it much harder to bring heresy charges against anybody if Pike would drop his demand for a trial. The bishops also agreed to make the term heresy obsolete. So I suppose now in the Episcopal Church, you can't be a heretic. Anything goes. The censure is now only for acts that people do that are terrible, but not for their opinions or their teachings. He created an advisory committee on theological freedom. Freedom is not a word you hear a lot in churches. So let's talk about his family. This is very sad. He had 4 children. And in 1966, one of his sons ended his own life. Not a lot of details about that, but Pike changed very much. He had been a chain smoker. He quit smoking. He'd been quite a drinker. He quit drinking. And he started to embrace spiritualism. He started to consult psychic mediums. He claimed that there was a poltergeist that was torturing him, kind of, doing weird things around his house, always at the same time of day as his son's death. So in 1967, he agreed to do a TV seance with a guy called Arthur Ford, who claimed to be a psychic medium. Now, later, he was called a fraud and was discredited. Ford was. There is a book about this. Pike wrote his own book called The Other Side. He had 4 children with his second wife, but he got caught living with his secretary. I guess that's how you teach at a bunch of different places. He was living with his secretary. So in 1965, his second wife, mother of his children, divorced him. And then the same thing happened to her that happened to his son in 1967. In 1968, big scandal, he married a student who had collaborated in writing the book The Other Side. She was 25 years his junior, and this was quite the hot topic. It's unclear if his second marriage ever ended in divorce or if they just separated and then his wife died. In either case, the third wedding to this younger woman had been okayed by the bishop who took over his job. And then at the very last minute, like right before the wedding, he said, "Oh no, I can't allow this. I can't sanction this." So they got married anyway. I'm sure they just found somebody to marry them. And 3 days after the wedding, he got barred from all his priestly duties, all his priestly functions, because he married without episcopal permission. And at that point, they were like, well, we've had enough of this. So they left the Episcopal Church and they established what they called the Foundation for Religious Transition. And it later, after his death, became the Bishop Pike Foundation. Their goal was to aid people on the edge of institutional Christianity. That's their definition. And I would suspect that what they were really talking about is people who had or were going through religious trauma, which is recognized these days as a thing. There are specialized therapists for it. So when he left the Episcopal Church, he said this is a quote: "The poor may inherit the earth, but it would appear that the rich, or at least the rigid, respectable, safe rich, will inherit the earth." Oh, I'm sorry, will inherit the church. I mucked that up. So the poor will inherit the earth, but it would appear the rich, or at least the rigid, respectable, and safe people will inherit the church. And then we come to his untimely and rather disturbing end. Now, there was a huge, long explanation of what happened to him. So I've tried to put it into something shorter and not quite so detailed. In August of 69, he and his wife went to Israel. They wanted to find evidence just for their own interest of the historical Jesus. So they wanted, Nazareth, Bethlehem, all that stuff. And they started out going to the Judean desert to look. Their goal was Qumran, hope I said that right, where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they got in the car and they thought, well, this is just a short hop across the desert, not realizing that that was the farthest thing from the truth. And they had no water and no guide with them. They got lost. Long story short, they got stuck. They couldn't unstick the car. So they decided to try to walk. But they'd been depending on a gas station map that was inaccurate. And they were off course to begin with. And when they walked, they got way farther off course. Eventually, after a few hours, middle of the day in the desert, he couldn't go any farther. And he was in his 60s, so this was probably a lot harder on him. He stayed somewhere under a rock in the shade while she continued ahead to get help. Her fear was if they found them both dead together, they would assume it was like a pact, and they didn't want people to think that. So off she went, and it took her 10 hours, but she climbed, and it was just a torturous description of what she went through. She found a camp of Arabs who were in the desert in the middle of nowhere, and they helped her. So a search went underway the next day because she found the camp late in the day and it was too late to go looking. And so they searched, and after the 5th day, they found his body. And what had happened is after she left, he decided to follow her. He went the wrong way, but he found a little lake, a little body of water that was potable. But instead of staying there, which would have saved him, he continued to go after her and died of exposure, hypothermia. He's buried in Jaffa in Israel. So here's where it gets really interesting. These things are so synchronistic. So if you want to go back and look at my videos, I've done a series of videos on Philip K. Dick, the author whose books I really don't like, but his philosophy I find absolutely intriguing, and I find him absolutely intriguing. I've done about 4 or 5 videos, including one with Deborah Lupien, which won't actually be out until next week. Yes, next week. I've got to pace them. I can't put 25 videos with Deborah in 1 week. It just wouldn't work very well. So, because not everybody has that taste. Some people want murder. Some people want philosophy, politics, cards. So I mix it up. So I was really surprised to hear that Bishop James Pike and Philip K. Dick were best friends. And I actually found a picture of them together. And they looked very chummy. They looked very happy, and like there was a good vibe going on, right? Pike, was the inspiration for the character Timothy Archer in Dick's book, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. Pike actually married Philip K. Dick and his wife. He performed the ceremony in 1966. Pike is also mentioned in the Radio Free Album by PKD, I'll call him. This is like The Man in the High Castle. It's an alternate history novel. Joan Didion talked about Pike in her White album. She did a whole thing on Grace Cathedral, and he was instrumental in that, so she talked about him. E.L. Doctorow wrote a book called The City of God in 2000, and it features Pike all the way through. So there are a lot of books about him. I just decided I was not going to go through that litany. A lot of books about him, and he himself wrote 7 books. But the most, well, there's so much shocking about him in the eyes of conventional Christians at the time. He really shook up the conservative people, the truly, conservative people. And really, a bridge too far was his interest in the paranormal and psychic stuff and, poltergeists and mediums. And that just really pushed people over the edge. I would like to read that book, The Other Side. Researching him is the first time I've ever heard of it. Haven't had the opportunity yet. So that's my little presentation on Bishop James Pike, a very interesting man, a man ahead of his times, I think. Kind of a man of the time, but a man challenging the status quo. And how weird is it that he was in that church, in charge of that, dean of that church at Lafayette Park. Stranger things. So thank you very much for watching. Double check your subscriptions. Something crazy's going on with subscriptions. And stay tuned because I have videos coming up or continuing. I've got a couple of series going. Some on the Antichrist, and there's some interesting predictive stuff in the next videos. And then a couple more on Philip Dick, because his philosophy, quantum physics, and the paranormal, very interesting intersection. So thank you. Thank you for watching. Slángafoil, slánte.